Well, good morning, everyone. I know a lot of people in this room, but I'm Jim Mooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and we want to welcome you to the Chamber's special event, Confronting the Housing Crisis, Supercharging Housing Production in Massachusetts, which apparently is on a lot of people's minds. People are still trickling in. This live segment is sold out. We expect I had registrations, about 120 people for this room and another couple of hundred online joining us. Welcome to our virtual attendees as well. So a popular subject matter, featuring some leaders and experts on housing. Today we're joined by the Secretary of Housing and Livable Communities, Juana Mateus, Dr. Emily Bayer, the Chamber's Director of Research, Doug Howgate, President of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, Dr. Jenny Schutz, who will be online, Vice President of Infrastructure at Arnold Ventures, and Tamara Small, who is the President of NAIOP. Many of you know that over the years, the Chamber's consistently invested in housing policy analysis and research to help our region address the housing crisis. And as we begin, let me be clear. Massachusetts has a housing crisis that is affecting our ability to attract and retain our population and our workforce that is our competitive advantage. And with that, while we appreciate and applaud some of the initiatives of state and municipal, at the state and municipal level of government to promote housing growth, our view is that they are not bold enough or urgent enough to match the level of the crisis, and in fact, at times have a negative effect on our ability to create more housing. Today's event is part of the Chamber's recent housing research report, which was authored by Dr. Emily Bayer, who you'll hear from in just a few minutes, to help explore how our competitor cities and states are addressing the housing crisis, what policy levers they are utilizing at the municipal and state level, and what we can consider here in Massachusetts. Our housing report was published at a critical juncture for housing policy in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and we acknowledge that efforts like the Affordable Homes Act and the MBTA Communities Act have begun to address some of the barriers to housing production. But we remain in a state of limited inventory and high housing prices today, where nobody can really foresee the path out of that over the next few years. And I continue to remind people that in addition to the policy aspects of our housing conversations regarding retaining workforce and growing our economy, that housing is personal to all of us. It impacts our lives, our families, our communities, and it is a subject matter of many kitchen table conversations in which people wonder, can my children afford to live here? We know that we need to build new housing, and it needs to be housing of all types across the state, but we must elevate our priorities around workforce housing. We hear every day from the Commonwealth's employers from all industries that high housing costs are negatively impacting our ability to attract and retain the talent that they need to compete in a 21st century global economy. When access to talent, one of the biggest competitive strengths of Massachusetts, becomes more difficult, it affects business decisions about where to invest, grow jobs, and deploy capital. And domestic outmigration continues with a large portion of our young residents who either do not think they will remain in Massachusetts in 5 years or are unsure if they will be here. The stakes are high, and the housing crisis needs leaders from government, the business community, nonprofit, and research community working together to prioritize and supercharge housing production. At the Chamber, we will continue to advocate for bold housing policies that promote housing production. So today's program, let me give you a sense of how this is going to run. We're going to hear presentations from Secretary Juana Mateus. We'll hear a presentation on the findings of our report by Dr. Emily Bayer. And we'll hear from Dr. Jenny Schutz, who is a national expert on the housing crisis. In fact, I had her book, but I don't have it right with me. Um, she'll talk about what's going on nationally in housing policy, what's working and what's not working. And after those presentations, we'll have a conversation with my friends Doug Howgate, Tamara Small, and Dr. Schutz, who will return for the panel conversation. Um, so now what I think I'll do is I'll walk through the introductions of those people so that the program can flow without the interruptions of their introductions. So I'll go through everyone's introductions and then we'll turn it over to the speakers. Let me start with Secretary Juana Mateus, who was appointed by the Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey in April of 2026 to lead the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. A lifelong advocate for opportunity, the Secretary has built her career around expanding access to safe, stable homes and strengthening pathways to economic mobility for Massachusetts residents. As the Secretary of the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, she leads the state's mission to create more homes and lower housing costs across Massachusetts. Before joining the Healey-Driscoll administration, the Secretary was appointed by President Biden to serve as a senior leader in the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, where she directed strategic planning and implementation for affordable housing, home ownership initiatives, community development, and enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. Previously, Secretary Mateus served as in the Massachusetts House of Representatives representing Lawrence. Join me in welcoming Secretary Mateus. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Emily Baird, the Director of Research here at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. In her role, Emily provides in-depth original research and data analysis to support the Chamber's public policy efforts, including emerging workforce, employment, and business trends, and the Chamber's leadership of the Business for Federal Research Funding Coalition. Previously, she was an assistant professor of political science at the University of New Hampshire, where she also served as director of the master's program in political science. Prior to her appointment at UNH, Emily served as an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow. Emily has published many articles, book chapters, and op-eds, and regularly spoken to news outlets on trends in American politics and policy, while receiving numerous grants and fellowships to support her research. Please join me in welcoming Emily. Now in the Friends column, I'm pleased to introduce Doug Howgate, president of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. Many of us know and admire Doug, who has started as president of the Taxpayers Foundation in 2023. After 2 years as the foundation's executive vice president, Doug also served at the foundation as research director. Prior to his time at the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, Doug held a number of prominent policy positions, including senior policy advisor to Senate President Karen Spilka and budget director at the Senate Committee on Ways and Means. Doug also served as deputy chief of staff at the Massachusetts Port Authority and a senior researcher at the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. Doug Howgate. Next, online somewhere, we have Dr. Jenny Schutz, the Vice President of Infrastructure at Arnold Ventures. Dr. Schutz leads Arnold Ventures' infrastructure portfolio for housing. In this role, she oversees Arnold Ventures' efforts to identify and enact policies that can successfully expand housing supply and make it easy to build more and different types of housing. Dr. Schutz came to Arnold Ventures with more than 25 years of experience in housing policy as a professor, economist, and author. She is a prolific writer on housing markets and authored the book Fixer Upper: How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems, which I've read several times, and I would encourage each of you to read as well. I'm sure you'll hear some of the contents of that in Jenny's presentation. Prior to Arnold Ventures, Jenny was a senior fellow at Brookings, Metro, and adjunct lecturer at Georgetown University. Jenny previously worked as an economist for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, as a professor at the University of Southern California and City College of New York, and a senior research affiliate at New York University. It's not in the bio I have, but I think she even lived in Somerville at one time. So Jenny, if you can hear us, please join me in welcoming Jenny. And my friend Tamara Small serves as CEO of NAIOP, Massachusetts, the Commercial Real Estate Development Association. Tamara is committed to building a diverse and equitable and inclusive culture within the commercial real estate industry. NAIOP provides educational and networking opportunities while advocating for laws, policies, and regulations that strengthen the industry. Tamara provides vision and leadership in establishing strategic initiatives and objectives for NAIOP while ensuring that the budget, staff, and priorities are aligned with the organization's core mission. Tamara serves on numerous regulatory working groups, regularly testifies before the legislature, and is the spokesperson for the organization, and an effective one, I might add at that. Tamara currently serves on the boards of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau and the 495 Metro West Partnership. Previously, Tamara served on the Commonwealth's Economic Development Planning Council, and she was appointed by the Haley Driscoll administration to serve on the Unlocking Housing Production Commission. So please join me in welcoming Tamara. So I think we have a pretty great lineup of knowledgeable people and the subject matter that we want to address. And we'll get the program started with Dr. Emily Baer, the Chamber's Director of Research and author of our housing report, for a presentation about that report, and then we'll hear some comments from Secretary Matias. So Emily, you want to take it over?
Thank you, Jim. So as Jim mentioned, housing has been top of mind for all of us here at the Chamber for quite some time. So I'm especially excited to get a chance today to share some of the highlights from our report. Now, there are a lot of organizations, some of whom are in the audience today, some of whom who are tuning in online, who've done great work on housing, have produced their own reports that have helped us understand some of the causes and consequences of our current housing crisis. But we here at the Chamber felt that there were still some unanswered questions about not just what our communities and our economy loses when our residents feel like they can't stay here due to housing, but also some of the advantages that they find in other states as housing markets and what we might be able to learn from those experiences. Just to give you a sense of some of the data and methodology of our report. We took a statewide approach in this report. I think we oftentimes understand housing as a locally driven issue through zoning and other local regulations. But we felt like because this is a statewide problem, we need to take a statewide approach. We drew from a variety of industry and government data sources like the Census Bureau, the IRS, the Massachusetts Association of Realtors, Zillow, and Realtor.com, among others. And our analysis focused on three key areas. So first, the demand for housing, which reflects both the needs of our current residents as well as future residents of the Commonwealth. And then second, the supply of housing. So how much housing we have, what type of housing we have, how much we are building of both single family and multifamily new construction, as well as the cost of our housing. Now, in addition to these kind of quantitative metrics on the demand and supply for housing, we also felt it was incredibly important to focus on solutions to the housing crisis. So the last thing we did in this report was a qualitative case study analysis of what other states are doing to promote new housing growth and affordability, what we can learn from other states' approaches. So along each of those key metrics on the demand and supply for housing, as well as those case studies, we focus not just on what's going on the ground in Massachusetts, but what is going on in these other states. And we focused on our economic competitors, or those states that we are most likely to lose population and businesses to. This includes places that I hear a lot when I overhear conversations on my daily commuter rail, so places like Texas and North Carolina, but also our neighbors of New Hampshire and Connecticut, as well as Florida, California, and New York. All right, so just to give you a sense of the scope of loss to these states, the figure on the left shows you net migration from 2011 to 2024. So negative numbers mean that we lost more residents to those states than we gained from those states. And over the past 5 years, we have had a net average loss to all 7 of these states, many in the thousands. As you can probably see pretty clearly, or at least I hope you can, the biggest losses were to the states of Florida and New Hampshire, where on average we lose about 20,000 residents per year. Just to put this number into perspective, in 2024, which is the most recent year that we have comprehensive state-to-state migration data for, we lost just over 30,000 residents total to other states. So the biggest portion are to those states of New Hampshire and Florida. Now, despite the steep domestic population loss, we are still continuing to grow due to international migration. So the data in the figure on the right gives you a sense of domestic and international migration and net total migration to the Commonwealth. The top outlined bar, I realize it's a little hard to see. This is the problem when there's so much data to parse through. Shows you the most recent data trends through the middle of last year of 2025. And while it does show a sharp drop in international migration due to federal policy changes, we are continuing to grow. And what this means is that our housing supply needs to not only expand to meet the deficit that our current residents face right now, but it also needs to grow to meet the needs of new residents who want to move here for their schooling, to build their careers and families and contribute to our communities and our economy. A shortage that is estimated to be about 222,000 housing units by 2035. All right, so what sort of housing market will our residents who leave Massachusetts for these other states find in these other states? So I think the clearest place where you can see the impact of the housing shortage are in our rental vacancy rates, which give you a sense of how easy it is to move around if your life circumstances and needs change, or if you move to Massachusetts, or if you want to move to Massachusetts from another state, how easy is it for you to find housing here? So this figure shows you the 4-quarter average vacancy rate over the past 20 years. It's a little hard to see, but hopefully you can tell Massachusetts is that thicker dark blue line with markers. And as you can see, we have consistently had a lower rental vacancy rate than these other key competitor states. And this is actually true nationwide as well. We're actually a little bit better off. So last year, our rental vacancy rate on average was 3.35%. And this is better than it was in 2023 when we had the absolute lowest in the country at 2.5%. Florida and Texas have a rate that is 3 times higher than ours. But you'll notice that, again, we have been ranking lower than all of these key other comparison states. Now, I will note here that a really high vacancy rate, it can be a sign of an unhealthy market. So a rate somewhere closer to about 7%, a little bit closer to where North Carolina was last year with a 6.5%, tends to be a good balance between meeting residential needs and property values and investments. But that is still nowhere close to where we have been. All right, another metric that we think is important if we're talking about the supply of housing is obviously how many new permits we are issuing. Now, unsurprisingly, the states that tend to build the most in total are those states with the largest population. So think about California and Texas. So in order to get a better sense of just how much we are building relative to other states, we controlled for population. Now, you can also do this by household size, but household sizes vary across the country. Some states simply might have more of a population with larger families or more multi-generational living. So these figures show you the number of newly permitted units per 100,000 residents in the state. Now, last year, we approved 170 total new housing units for every 100,000 residents. And this is less than all of our competitors, including Connecticut, which historically in recent years has not been building quite as much as we have been. New Hampshire's permitting rate is more than double ours. Florida's, North Carolina's, and Texas's rate, they tend to approve triple to quadruple the number of new units as we do. Multifamily homes comprise about 3 out of every newly permitted home in the state. And this is double the proportion that you see in North Carolina and Texas. But we are still building in total far fewer multifamily homes per capita than we are in other states. A gap in supply that is helping to drive up prices. Now, these figures are from Zillow and show you the average rents in several Massachusetts communities last year and how they've changed over time. This measure is the mean of monthly rents from the 35th to the 65th percentile of all homes and apartments in a community, weighted to reflect the housing stock. And while Boston kind of quite clearly has a particularly high average rent listed here, one thing I want to emphasize, if you take a look at Pittsfield, is that Pittsfield has had the largest percentage increase over the past year and over the past 5 years. So that should dispel any notion that our housing crisis is just a Boston area problem. It is very much a statewide crisis that needs to be confronted. Now, relative to our competitors, only California has a higher median rent than ours. More than 50% of Massachusetts renters are cost burdened in that they spend more than a third of their income on rent. Now, while this is higher than the national average, we are actually a little bit better off on this metric than some of our competitors. In the state of Florida, more than 60% of their renters spend more than 30% of their income on rent, so they are cost burdened. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that while household incomes have not risen quite as much as rents have risen since about the 2008 housing market crash, Massachusetts has not seen as big of a jump in that number of cost-burdened renters because our pool of renters has become a little bit larger and slightly wealthier over time as home ownership became more inaccessible for more individuals. All right, so let's take a look at home prices. So I'm sure, as many of you are aware, the COVID pandemic dramatically reshaped the home market as interest rates fell and the ability of remote work and telecommuting made it possible for more individuals to buy homes in more geographic areas. So this figure shows you the median monthly home list price, and this is from Realtor.com. And it should give you, I'll also note, the full report includes a lot of data from Zillow and the Massachusetts Association of Realtors on home values and final home sale prices. So I encourage you to read the full report if you want even more background information on different metrics here. But as you can see, since 2023, we have tracked pretty closely with California for the most expensive home listing prices among these key competitor states. Last month, just to note, this data goes through June of 2026. The median home price listed in Massachusetts was $759,500. Home prices have actually come down a little bit over the past year to 18 months, but they are still far cheaper in New Hampshire and our competitor states. Now, there's a couple other things I want to mention here that we dive into even more in the report. So one, while household incomes across these states do vary dramatically, Massachusetts has the highest median household income in the country. The home price to income ratio, which gives them a sense of how accessible home ownership is for the median household, is lower in these states than it is in Massachusetts. So it's not enough that we have such high median household incomes. The other thing I want to note that, again, the report dives into a little bit more is how condo and single-family home prices have diverged. Prior to the pandemic in 2020, condos sold for about 7% less than single-family homes, and that has jumped to about 20% less than single-family homes, suggesting that there really is a dearth of supply of those single-family homes to meet demand. All right, so just to summarize kind of what the key findings are of our report, our residents have fewer housing options and face higher housing expenses than in all of our other key competitor states. And what is particularly telling here is not just the scale of the problem, the absolute lowest rental vacancy rate, the highest median home list price, but that these trends hold true not just in places with lower cost of living like Texas and Florida, but also in places with higher cost of living like New York and California. It is also notable that all of these states are also facing their own housing shortage, ranging from the tens of thousands to more than 1 million homes, depending on what timetable they're projecting outwards to. But even though they're facing those same shortages, they are having more success at building more homes to help to meet their residents' needs. All right, I want to briefly touch on the third component of the report, which is a qualitative case study analysis of what other states are doing to build more housing. Now, there are a lot of ideas in the report from a lot of different perspectives. So again, I encourage you to review that to get even more initiatives and learn from the experiences of those other states. But what I want to do is just briefly highlight the experience in 2 states. So first, I want to spotlight Houston, Texas. Now, Houston has always had somewhat of a unique approach to zoning and residential development. For those of you who are closely steeped in this area, you are probably very aware of this. But in the late 1990s, the city cut minimum lot sizes for both townhomes and single-family homes to as small as 1,400 to 3,500 square feet. And Houston's policy was initially limited to the downtown core and later expanded throughout the city. Within a few years, Houston's initiative led to a sharp increase in the permitting rates of both single-family and townhomes, doubling to tripling the rate of permitting. We also looked at Philadelphia, which established a series of 10-year tax abatements to facilitate commercial to residential developments. This was later expanded to new construction and home renovations as well. And this was in the 1990s, when the city was facing population decline and declining property values and vacant lots across the city. These tax abatements helped triple the city's permitting rates in the years to follow. Now, I said we took a statewide approach in this report. So these examples are what we would call policy diffusion, where other localities and states are adopting and applying insights from the experiences of these communities. And you can even see this in other communities across Texas and across Pennsylvania. So last year, the Texas legislature applied some of the insights from the Houston experience and reduced minimum lot sizes to a series of municipalities across the state to 3,000 square feet. Likewise, Pennsylvania's governor last year signed into law a budget which expanded their 20-year tax abatement program to facilitate the conversion of commercial, government, and school buildings into new housing. Now, the Chamber kept these initiatives and experiences of other states in mind and also took a look at the things that Massachusetts is already leaning on and has invested in to try to boost housing development and put together a series of policy proposals to help to supercharge housing development in the Commonwealth. So the first and largest set of proposals are designed to decrease the cost to build new homes. Now, we recognize that there are a lot of external pressures on home development. You can obviously, I think all of us are very aware of the effect of tariffs and high inflation rates on the cost to build new homes. But what policy levers do we have at the state level to provide more tools to municipalities and increase the likelihood that more projects will make it to meet our residential needs? So we've already seen some movement on some of these. So I'll specifically highlight the sales tax exemption for construction materials. But I want to just briefly note, we also included other initiatives like an expansion of Boston's tax abatement policy, which has been very successful thus far in moving more projects and units to market. We think this is something that needs to be expanded to help to continue to bring down the cost of new construction. The other thing I'll highlight, things like re-examining building codes and environmental reviews, which is something that the state of California has taken a closer look at to try to make it cheaper for new homes to come to market. All right, now in addition to these efforts focused on decreasing the cost of housing, a few of the other policy initiatives that we looked at were decreasing some of the uncertainties and delays that are kind of endemic to the building process. So this includes things like continuing to reaffirm already approved permits so that when there are development delays that are kind of outside of your control due to fiscal and economic uncertainties, that we're not adding even more additional delays requiring the permitting process to start over again. We also think it's important to increase our capacity to build. And one way to do this is to decrease minimum lot sizes, as Houston did, which in some of the communities across Massachusetts can be an acre or more. All right, so thank you so much for giving me your time to hear some of the highlights of our report. Again, I encourage you to review the full report. It includes a lot more detail on all of those policy initiatives, on some of the policy case studies of what we can learn from other states, as well as all of those quantitative metrics on the supply and demand for housing. And with that, I am very excited to welcome the Secretary of Housing and Livable Communities, Secretary Matthias, to share some of the state's perspective on these important issues and what we can do to build more housing in the Commonwealth.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jim, for the kind introduction and for your leadership here at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. Thank you to Emily Baer and the Chamber team for putting this important report together and for bringing us here today to discuss what more we need to be doing to move the needle on housing production across our Commonwealth. And finally, I want to thank everyone in the room. Employers, developers, advocates, civic and municipal leaders, researchers, labor partners, and lenders. The fact you are here today speaks to a shared understanding that housing is not an isolated issue. It is one of the defining economic challenges of our generation because it touches every part of our economy. Housing is economic infrastructure. It is the foundation of a strong workforce, a competitive economy, and thriving communities. It determines whether businesses can recruit and retain talent, whether families can afford to stay in Massachusetts, and whether our Commonwealth continues to lead. The future of Massachusetts will be shaped by what we choose to do together. The housing challenge before us, as you heard Emily share, did not emerge overnight. For decades, Massachusetts has underproduced housing. Years of restrictive zoning, unpredictable permitting, rising construction costs, and fragmented local rules created a system that made it much easier to say no than yes. That persistent underproduction has driven up costs, limited choices for families, and made it harder for employers to recruit and retain the workforce we need. The Chamber's report brings those challenges to life in ways so many people in this room already experience every day. Earlier this year, the Boston Globe profiled Paola Ayala Lopez, a 27-year-old graphic designer who moved to Boston for work. She built community here. She built a life here. But even while sharing costs with her partner, she told the Globe she expects that within a few years, she will be priced out of Massachusetts altogether. That is the challenge we face. A young professional does what we ask them to do, gets an education, finds a job, builds community, contributes to our economy, and still has to wonder whether she can afford to stay. That is more than a housing challenge. It is a competitiveness challenge, and it is exactly why we cannot afford the status quo. We also have to be realistic about the conditions around us. We do not control interest rates, insurance costs, construction materials, or the national markets that determine whether projects can pencil out. And at the federal level, states have not had the strong partner we need to meet the scale of our housing and homelessness challenges. But that cannot become an excuse for an inaction. It makes state and local leadership and the partnerships in this room even more important. For me, this work is deeply personal. When my family came to this country from the Dominican Republic, housing was attainable. Having a safe, affordable place to call home gave us the stability to put down roots, pursue opportunity, and build our American dream. That is what housing makes possible. It creates opportunity. It gives children a place to thrive, helps families build stability, allows older adults to age with dignity, and gives young people the confidence to build a future in Massachusetts. That is the promise of housing, and it is a promise we cannot afford to lose. That is why since day one, the Healy-Driscoll administration has made expanding housing one of our highest priorities. We know that meeting this moment requires urgency, partnership, and a sustained commitment to building more homes across every region in the state. The Greater Boston Chamber's report reinforces something we have believed from the very beginning. Solving our housing shortage will require not only sustained investment, but structural reform. The Chamber's report and the state's housing plan use different lenses to arrive at the same conclusion. Massachusetts needs more homes, and we need to change how we build them. Our approach is built around three priorities: make it easier to build, invest at scale, and embrace innovation. That is why Governor Healy established the Unlocking Housing Production Commission. Its recommendations have become an important roadmap for modernizing housing production, and many of those ideas are already being translated into action. The commission's report, Building for Tomorrow, did not nibble around the edges. It put forward bold, practical ideas to unlock land, modernize permitting, support innovation, and create the kinds of homes Massachusetts needs at the scale this moment demands. It also showed that right by right zoning is one of the most important tools we have. Here are some examples of how we're seeing that impact already. After making accessory dwelling units legal by right statewide, more than 1,200 ADUs were permitted or approved in more than 200 communities across the state. That was just a start. Now we're making it easier and more affordable to build ADUs with new financing programs to help homeowners move from possibility to construction. Through the MBTA Communities Law, municipalities are creating new multifamily zoning districts that have put more than 9,000 homes in the pipeline. This one law will continue to create housing for decades to come. Through our state land for homes initiatives, we're turning underutilized land into homes while putting those properties back on the local tax rolls. We've already identified more than 700 acres that will yield an approximate 5,600 homes. And through the Mass Wins Act and Mass Ready Act, we are working to make permitting more predictable, streamlining review for priority housing and infrastructure projects, and reducing unnecessary barriers so good projects can move from concept to construction more quickly. And our structural reform must also be matched by historic investment. The Affordable Homes Act authorized $5.16 billion over 5 years because Governor Healy and Lieutenant Governor Driscoll recognized that housing affordability is not just an economic, but also a social challenge. And this year, our administration is nearly doubling capital investments in housing. We're already seeing the results of those investments. Last month, I toured a 11-story building, office building in downtown Worcester that was sat vacant. Now it's home to the largest commercial to residential conversion project so far in the state. I walked around a beautiful new apartment with panoramic views of the city that several years ago had just been office cubicles. The new commercial conversion tax credit initiative made that possible. Right here in Boston, the State Land for Home initiative is being used to turn 6.5 acres of government services center into 600 new homes. Developments like these are game changers, and those programs, along with HDIP, the Momentum Fund, and others that we have funded, are working. The Chamber's report recommended strengthening proven production tools like HDIP and the Momentum Fund, and we support that. But investment and regulatory reform alone will not produce the number of homes Massachusetts needs alone. We must be willing to think differently. The housing shortage will be solved by giving ourselves permission to build differently, explore new partnerships, and innovate. Traditional affordable housing will always be an essential part of our strategy, but it cannot be our only strategy if we are serious about meeting the scale of this challenge. We have to ask ourselves, how do we build faster? How can we build more affordably? How can we embrace modular and manufactured housing and other innovations that expand opportunity while lowering costs? Because at the end of the day, this is about creating attainable pathways to homeownership, strengthening our workforce, revitalizing communities, and ensuring Massachusetts is a place where everyone can build a future. And if we're serious about solving our housing shortage, we have to make it easier to build, easier to invest, and easier to innovate. That is how we build the future together. So let me close with a simple ask. Continue to lead. Continue showing up in the State House, in city halls and town halls, in your boardrooms and in your communities. Continue making the case that housing is key to our competitiveness as a state, because when the business community shows up and speaks with one voice about the importance of housing, people listen. Massachusetts has faced defining moments before. In the 1980s, government, business, higher education, and communities came together to transform our economy in what was known as the Massachusetts miracle. Today, we face a different challenge, but opportunity is just as great. Now it is our turn to lead on housing, because the next generation should not have to leave Massachusetts to find opportunity. They should be able to build their careers here, raise their families here, start businesses here, and grow old here in the communities they love. That is the future we are building. And if we meet this moment with the urgency, partnership, and shared sense of purpose, we will do far more than build 222,000 units. We will strengthen our workforce, we will grow our economy, and we will expand opportunity. And together we will build the Massachusetts that the next generation deserves. Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
So much. Well, Secretary Matias, thank you not only for sharing your time with us today, but your insights and your passion for this issue. And I know that I speak for my colleagues throughout the business community in accepting your invitation to partner in dealing with this crisis with some urgency. We're going to move now to our virtual guest, Dr. Jenny Schutz, who's the Vice President of Infrastructure Housing at Arnold Ventures. And I mentioned earlier that I discovered Jenny's book, Fixer Upper: How to Repair America's Broken Housing Systems, several years ago. And I read it. It's fascinating and interesting. So I reached out to her. I've heard her speak now several times. And she brings a great deal of knowledge, experience to this crisis from a national level that will expand on some of the things Emily talked about. So, Jenny, sorry you couldn't be here today, but we want to thank you for joining us virtually and for sharing some of your insights. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for allowing me to join you virtually. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there in person today, but it's great to see that Boston and Massachusetts are leaning into some of the solutions and paying attention to this really urgent issue, which has been going on in Massachusetts for a long time, but has only become more acute in the last several years. So moving to the next slide, today I want to give you a little bit of a national overview of not just what the problem is, but what some of the solutions are that are starting to emerge from state and local governments across the country. You may have seen versions of this map before. This is showing you the gap between housing demand and housing supply across the country. So you can see that at this point, we almost have a national underproduction problem. Almost every state in the country now has fewer housing units than we need just to meet the demand of people who are in our communities now, not even considering future population growth. Massachusetts is not a huge state, but it is a large part of the national housing shortage. You can see from this estimate that it was about 100,000 units short a couple of years ago, and that gap continues to grow over time. Next slide. We know a fair amount now about what the problems are that are leading us to underbuild housing year after year across the country. Overly restrictive regulations, primarily at the local level, make it hard to build housing, and especially hard to build in some of our highest opportunity communities, places that have great job markets, great public schools, high amenities, high quality of life. Many of those are the communities in Massachusetts, particularly some of the places close to jobs, close to transit with great public services. In particular, this binds at a couple of places in the housing market. There isn't nearly enough rental housing in these high opportunity communities, so people can't even afford to get their foot in the door if the price of entry is buying a home in many of these places. And we don't have enough starter homes for people who are transitioning from renters to first-time homeowners. Again, these tend to bind on younger households earlier in their career because they're earning less money, haven't saved up enough for a down payment. And so this really winds up being a penalty on early career workers and early career households, which contributes to states like Massachusetts losing younger households and becoming an older community over time as younger people just can't stay there and build a life. I want to talk today a little bit about some of the solutions that are coming out of particularly state and local governments, and think about the ways that we can tailor these for communities. It is important to understand that what's built on the ground currently does impact which solutions are going to have the most impact, generate the most amount of new housing, and to prioritize those appropriately. I want to think a little bit about how state governments in particular can help, and because we have some new news on the national scale, I'll talk a little bit about the latest federal effort to engage with housing production. And then I want to share also some tips for how to talk about housing supply and the need for more housing when you go out to your communities to engage people in ways that make these conversations constructive. Next slide, please. Moving forward. Broadly speaking, there are three types of regulatory reforms that can help unlock housing supply. One of these is legalizing homes of all shapes and sizes. We've seen some of the findings from the Boston Chamber of Commerce report that shows the shortfall, particularly in things like entry-level starter homes, making it easier to build homes that are not just single-family detached houses and big apartment buildings, but everything in between, allows people more choice and to find a house that fits them at their life stage and their budget. So legalizing homes of different shapes and sizes is the first type. Second, bringing down the hard costs of construction. It's simply become very expensive in bricks and mortar and labor to build a house. And so embracing innovation and some strategic changes to things like the building code can make it cheaper to build homes. And then third, making the development process overall shorter, simpler, and more transparent through things like by right zoning, making the permitting process more transparent and more fair. Places like greater Boston suburbs tend to have very complicated and long processes that makes it expensive to add housing, and especially in time periods like now when interest rates are high and developers have to carry those costs for a long time. Which of these rules unlocks the most supply and adds the most housing does vary depending on local markets. And I think it's important to move beyond just an idea that this is an urban core, very expensive market kind of problem. We need to think about the policy solutions that can work in our urban core, in our suburban communities, and even in small towns and rural areas, which increasingly are facing upwards pressure on housing supply and housing prices. Next slide, please. To help visualize what this looks like, this may look familiar to you. These are some homes in Wellesley. All of these are within walking distance of the commuter rail station into downtown Boston, but this shows you communities where the dominant housing type is single-family homes on large lots, often 1 to 2 acre minimum lot sizes. So this produces a lot of big open space in the form of yards, but it means that very few homes can be built in these communities, and essentially they are built out at their current zoning capacity. But this also means that there are lots of ways to add housing in communities that have these very large single-family homes. If you allow, for instance, small homes on small lots, as the Starter Homes Ballot Initiative is proposing, you could buy one single-family home on a 2 acre plot and subdivide that and build many more small detached houses and allow more people entry into homeownership. You could also build something like townhouse clusters or low-rise apartment buildings, all of which are still very much in scale of a residential community, but would add many more housing opportunities at lower price points than the existing homes and just make those communities more accessible for people who can't afford to live there now. Next slide, please. The kinds of reforms that would matter most in our urban core are going to be a little bit different. So if you think about some of the smaller communities that may have a commercial main street or downtown, like this one, Jim mentioned Somerville, Massachusetts, which is already one of the most densely built out communities with very little open space. How do you add capacity in a place like Somerville? You're going to need to be able to move from triple deckers to taller buildings. And so making sure the building height allows that. This is also the kind of environment where things like mandatory parking requirements can be really difficult to add because there isn't space to have parking at the rear of a lot. And so making sure that communities can add more housing without requiring expensive structured parking spaces. Thinking about things like the setbacks, which already don't allow for a lot of expansion, but making sure that that's not prohibiting development into larger buildings over time. Next slide, please. So I want to think now about what state governments across the country are doing and can do. Next slide. We have seen an explosion of interest from state houses across the country in helping to make it easier to build more homes. And so we're seeing a lot of experimentation. One of the notable things, if you look at this map, this is showing us a year ago's state legislative sessions, is that we're seeing experimentation in red states and blue states, in predominantly urban states, and in largely rural and suburban communities. So this is really a national phenomenon now that state governments are leaning into helping out to make housing production easier, more predictable, and experimenting with what they can do also to support local governments with more innovative policies. We looked at the next slide. It shows a breakdown of the types of things that states are doing. Some of these Massachusetts is already working on or has already enacted. allowing accessory dwelling units in residential communities is by far the most popular statewide policy. Massachusetts has already made that legal, and this is one of the easiest areas to start because it's not adding a lot of visible density in communities, but allows people to build something in their backyard, in their garage, to convert their basement into a rental unit. And this can be helpful for things like aging in place, having a caretaker on site, or for renting out an apartment and having a little bit of extra money in order to help pay the mortgage. So that's been a very popular policy in a number of states. Other states have moved beyond that to legalizing what we can call gentle density or middle housing, everything from duplexes, townhouses to small apartment buildings, also generally in single family residential neighborhoods. And again, thinking about the pictures of Wellesley, if you could build a fourplex instead of a single family home on all of those plots, you can add a number of housing units while staying largely in the same kind of character. Zoning for high density inner transit, Massachusetts is in fact a nationwide leader in having passed the MBTA communities before most other states were really getting into this game. And we have seen it's taken a while for the bill to roll out, but there is a healthy pipeline. And the hope is that more of these projects will work out over time, that developers will get confidence that they are able to use this new law to build apartments near transit to take advantage of Massachusetts' really stellar transit infrastructure, which has the benefit of adding more homes and also putting more people within walking distance of the commuter rail and can shore up ridership on the transit system as well. So this is a win-win in a lot of ways. And then finally, we're seeing a lot more interest in reducing parking minimums, allowing property owners and developers the flexibility to add the amount of parking that's appropriate for the site instead of requiring a blanket policy, which can be very expensive and make deals not pencil out. Next slide, please. We've seen also states like Massachusetts really think about how they can implement these kinds of housing policies in ways that aren't necessarily punitive of local governments. Often the state worries about political pushback from local governments, especially where there's a strong home rule tradition, and people often leap immediately to the state is going to sue local governments for noncompliance. Fortunately, most local governments actually have not fought the statewide laws that hard. They realize that this is something that's important to their own voters, their own constituents. And so a lot of the work winds up being on kind of the softer side, doing technical assistance and training for local staff, especially in smaller communities that don't have full-time planners on staff who can do a code rewrite and identify the things that need to change. And the Office of Housing and Livable Communities has done a terrific job at doing these kinds of outreach, office hours, and support for local planners to help them put better policies in place, while also then following up to make sure that the Miltons of the world who just don't want to comply are going to have to do their fair share as well. And so this wide range of tools is really important. And having an Attorney General's office that knows what tool to apply and is willing to lean into this has been very helpful for Massachusetts in getting its policies into place. Next slide, please. Amazingly enough, as I sit here in Washington, D.C., Congress has passed a bipartisan housing law. This is notable not just because at the moment there's not a lot of bipartisan energy on most issues, but also because this is the first time that Congress has really leaned into housing supply. Typically, federal attention has been much more on the demand side and subsidies for housing. But we have seen members of Congress from both parties in the House and the Senate, many different kinds of communities, getting attention and pushback from their constituents, saying, we want Congress to be part of the solution. We want it to lean in and help. So the road to housing became law as of midnight last Friday. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren was a key figure on the Senate side, along with South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, in really working to get that over the finish line. And over the next several weeks and months, we'll start to get more information about how that's going to roll out at the state and local level. There's some funding sources that will be available. There's some incentives for local governments to do more planning and things like improvements to the rules around manufactured housing, which can be a very affordable starter home option. Next slide, please. I want to shift now to talk a little bit about how you talk about housing production and the need for more housing when we go out into our communities. We know that this is really important for bringing people into the conversation who may not think about this issue all the time or may not be aware of some of the problems and how to solve them. Next slide, please. Some of the work that we have done at Arnold Ventures is message testing to figure out how can you talk about this in a way that doesn't immediately make people's eyes glaze over. It turns out when you walk into most rooms and say, I'm here to talk about zoning reform, you don't bring along a lot of energy, and most people don't understand why that matters. So we've identified a 5-part framework that resonates with audiences across the political spectrum and of all ages, both homeowners and renters, that really comes down to emphasizing people's lived experiences. Start by acknowledging what everybody understands, which is that the costs of housing are too high. People can't afford to buy a home, to rent an apartment in the communities where they want to live, where they have high opportunity. And certainly in Massachusetts, nobody is going to argue with you on that one or have difficulty understanding it. Explaining how this links up to a shortage, it's helpful to do things like, when the house on your block goes on sale and 50 people show up to the open house, only one person is going to get that house and 49 people are still going to be looking. That's what leads to prices going up. And so we need to have more houses so we don't have 49 disappointed potential buyers. It's also really important, if we go to the next slide, to frame how this matters for the people who are already in your communities, not just about forward-looking growth and people who want to move in, but the people who are already in our communities now. Again, this should be very intuitive for folks in Massachusetts. Teachers, childcare workers, retail workers, home health care aides already are in the communities and working there, but are living in places like New Hampshire across the border where housing is cheaper. People who are working in the communities now and maybe renters can't afford to buy and may move to cheaper states like Texas and Florida and North Carolina. So this is very much about helping people who are currently in our communities but can't afford to stay or can't afford the lifestyle that they want to have. Next slide, please. It's also really important where we can to be specific about the policy changes that we're advocating for and to make this seem like a common sense change that people can understand. So making it legal to build an ADU in your backyard, making it easier to build homes of all shapes and sizes, like the triple deckers that are already in our communities. These are ways that people can understand the policy changes in tangible ways. Something like ending single family zoning sounds very abstract and very scary and winds up not helping the conversation move forward. So we want to focus on positive changes that help us build better communities. Next slide, please. This is an exciting time to be working in the field of housing policy. We're seeing a lot of experimentation, a lot more openness in the public debate. People across the country understand we don't have enough homes, housing is too expensive. This is an issue of economic competitiveness. This is an issue of economic opportunity and well-being. And it's something that we have to address at this point, not just for future generations and population growth, but for people who are having a hard time and struggling today. We've seen an enormous shift in the public debate, more openness and more willingness for people to embrace experimentation. State level reforms are picking up steam across the country, and we're seeing a lot more evidence of what works and what doesn't in different kinds of housing markets. We'll be sharing more of that research as it comes available. It is important to temper our expectations, particularly given the current macroeconomic climate, high interest rates, tariffs, high cost of building materials, most of which are imported to the US. All of these are going to make it hard for markets to respond quickly. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be pushing for policy reforms. It just means it may take a little while before that shows up. So it's important to get the right policies in place so that as the macroeconomic climate becomes more friendly to development, builders are able to pick up the reins and move forward with projects more quickly. Thank you for giving me time to join you today. I look forward to the questions and the panel discussion.
And to join us for this portion of the event. Doug, I want to get you in quickly here. The Mass Taxpayers Foundation also recently released a report on the challenges of the housing market. Just speaks to the fact that we're all very much focused and aligned on trying to deal with this crisis. It makes a proposal about momentum zone pilot program. Tell us about momentum zones and how they fit into this conversation.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks so much for the event today and for the partnership on this. And I really want to give credit to Emily and the chamber report on this. So many incredible pieces of information there and actionable pieces of information. And I think it really aligns with what we've talked about in the presentation we just heard related to momentum zones. You know, when I think about other policy areas, defining success and demonstrating success is always really important. And sometimes it's easy, right? When you talk about K-12 funding reform, you're defining success often as spending more money on education. There are other better ways to define success in that area. But when you look at how a bill did in terms of dedicating more resources to a community or things like that, there are relatively tangible ways you can look at that in the near term to see how you do that. Healthcare access, right? What share of folks are we covering? As we just saw on this slide with risks, one of the real challenges with housing is these things take time. A lot of the things that are going to kind of impact housing production in Massachusetts are outside of our control. And there is tension between some of the goals and some of the policies that we have in Massachusetts in areas like energy or areas like affordability policy, when you think of affordability set-asides, and production of housing. And so one of the goals for this Momentum Zone pilot is to try to create a context to demonstrate clear success and to show that you can still have, I think, really important goals in areas like energy and areas like affordability set-asides that can work with housing production. So the idea is basically to say, let's create some geographic zones around the state. And in those zones, we're going to do a couple things. One, we're going to kind of surge some of the programs that the state has. The state has a number of different policy and financial tools in place to incentivize housing production, public infrastructure, things like that. But they don't often work together, right? They don't often work together and so you tend to have these kind of, you have to go after a source of funding in one area, then another area. So let's braid them together. And let's also at the same time connect with the municipality to say, so what you're going to get out of this is you're going to get this surge of state resources to help get projects off the ground. But we're going to ask you to come to the table with maybe it's property tax abatements. We see in the report how common that is as a tool to get housing production going. Sales tax exemptions. Putting a pause on a stretch energy code, getting rid of an affordability set aside. And the goal is to say to folks who strongly believe, understandably, that we should have affordability set asides, we should have strong energy goals, is to say, let's see if in this one area, let's take downtown Boston, where we can agree we need more housing production, that's going to be the number one policy priority in this area. Doesn't mean you need to walk away from these goals everywhere else, but let's see if we can make a real difference on housing production here. And the goal with it is to demonstrate success, right? Because resources at the state level are also finite. And sometimes when you try to spread those resources statewide, it's really hard to show the impact. Whereas if we can concentrate it in a few areas, I think we can build some of that muscle memory that we can make a difference and make these things work together.
Jenny, are you seeing examples of this type of zone approach that Doug talked about around the country?
So there definitely are some areas that are trying to lift some of the regulations in certain places to encourage it. I think energy efficiency is an interesting area to bring up because often we forget that just new housing is much more energy efficient than old housing. If you ratchet up the requirements of energy efficiency and put sort of extra bells and whistles on it, you wind up making it so expensive to build new housing that we don't. And then we wind up with keeping a lot of the older housing that is really energy inefficient, that is less safe and less habitable for communities. So I think that, this point about weighing the trade-offs really carefully, small amounts of affordable housing are better than no amounts of affordable housing. So a 10% set aside that actually produces units is better than a 50% set aside that kills development altogether. So keep these trade-offs in mind. We want to be building more homes, more newer homes, and the only way you get this is if you make the regulations actually pencil.
Right, Pamela, your organization represent members engaged in all parts of the home building and buying process. Talk about what you're hearing from some of your members, their challenges facing housing production and their businesses now. And maybe be a little positive and share a success story of some things that are working in different communities around the Commonwealth.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jim, for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I think actually it's a really positive time for housing policy right now. There have been reports over the years and NIMBYism has been real for a long time. But the fact that we have the business community speaking about this and recognizing that this is something that's essential to our competitiveness, that it's not just the developer-led organizations who are talking about it, but it's really just a conversation that permeates every type of policy right now. Just in the past few weeks, if we take a look at some of the policies that have actually been put in place. So the supplemental budget included the sales tax relief for building multifamily projects. So, while we have the reports from the chamber and the taxpayers and Unlocking Housing Production Commission, oftentimes these reports, they're great effort. They sit on a shelf, they collect dust, and people forget about them. That is most certainly not the case right now. So we are seeing, even within the chamber's own report, you can go down that list of recommendations and check a lot of boxes. So, between the supplemental budget, between the budget that was just signed into law by the governor, a number of very significant zoning changes were included in the budget. That's now law. And then we take a look at the economic development bill. And there are things that we as an organization have been talking about for years that were just best practices that are now moving forward, thanks to leadership of, business groups, but also the legislature for recognizing things like the Permit Extension Act. This was something that was put in place in 2008 when everything kind of came to a halt. It was extended again in 2010. And then in 2024, recognizing everything was stuck again, it was signed into law. Well, it's about to expire. And it was included, an extension of the Permit Extension Act was included in the House Economic Development Bill, site plan review, energy code appeals, planning board training for local boards and commissions. This may seem kind of boring, but oftentimes, everything is local. And so when you have members of a planning board or a conservation commission who do it, they may not know what they're actually getting into, but have truly no knowledge of, what they're regulating. It doesn't end well for housing and development. So this would require EUHLC to provide this essential training. That's going to make a huge difference. So these are just a handful of policies that are now being included in important bills. We're hoping to see a final economic development bill by the end of the month. And it's a really exciting time. In terms of what we're seeing, best practices, I would point to Revere. You got Suffolk Downs. Suffolk Downs is in Boston and it's in Revere. Development's only happening on one side of that project. It's happening in Revere. In Boston, there are inclusionary development requirements that are at 20%. It doesn't pencil. No housing's being built. Revere doesn't have inclusionary development. They're building housing. They're building market rate. They don't have the same energy restrictions that are driving up costs in Revere as they do in Boston. So you can literally look at one piece of land, and I see John Chesto here has talked about this. It's a perfect case study to see if you take a look at what policies work, you can still, achieve these goals by being pragmatic and kind of balancing all of those things together. So I think, it's a really exciting time. We have some local leaders, again, on the Unlocking Housing Production Commission. There were some local mayors who really stepped in and said, we want housing in our community. We want to keep our young people here. We want to make sure the older people have a place to live. How can we get involved? And so it's been fantastic to see leadership, certainly at the state level, but also at the local level too.
I'm going to come right back to you. Another group of our colleagues at the Boston Foundation, hot off the press, released a report just yesterday entitled Unlocking Small Multifamily Housing Through Building Code Reform, which speaks to the difference between low-level residential and what is defined as commercial development. Tamara, could you explain a little bit about their recommendation and what your thoughts are?
Sure. This is the stuff that isn't all that sexy or exciting, like zoning, but building codes really make a big difference. Energy codes make a big difference. So this report that came out yesterday talks about the difference between the International Residential Code and the International Building Code. So once you get above 2 units of housing, you have to comply with the International Building Code, which adds on significant new regulatory requirements, all of which have costs. So frankly, it's almost impossible to build a triple decker here in Massachusetts, something that's such a part of our culture here in Massachusetts. You can't build it today. So what ends up happening is you end up building very, very large projects that are require a significant amount of land, and you can't get to that kind of lower level type of housing that we very much need here in Massachusetts. So the estimate that the Boston Foundation put forward was that it increases cost by 40% to go from one code to the other, a 40% increase. That's not going to help our housing goals. So how can we take a look at, making this kind of in-between land where you don't have to comply with the International Building Code, and we can advance those, smaller projects that are needed on smaller parcels of land. Density is a good thing. It's good for the environment. It's good if you're near transit, oftentimes. times, you're going to get more dense development. So I think it's an important report, and it just highlights that these little tweaks here and there that we're starting to see will have a major, major impact, down the road.
Jenny, are you seeing other states adopt this sort of what Tamara described as the middle zone between these two codes?
Yes, Tamara's exactly right. Building code has been ignored relative to zoning, but turns out to matter a lot for the dollars and cents of development. And the Boston Foundation report picks up some of the work that's coming out of Memphis at the city level and that states like North Carolina have picked up, making it easier to build small buildings up to fourplexes or sixplexes in some cases under the residential code. Turns out one of the little hidden details here is sprinklers. Single-family detached homes don't have to have sprinklers in them. Multifamily buildings under the commercial building code do. Sprinkler systems are really expensive to install because then there's the potential for water to backflow. And so just the addition of requiring sprinklers in something like a duplex or a triple decker basically makes it infeasible to build. So really taking a hard look at what the triple deckers currently have and make sure that you can rebuild the existing things in the same way without adding on a lot of expensive things that weren't in the code at the time they were built, but have been added over time and just add costs.
So a simple step of going from 2 units to 3 units changes the sprinkler code in Massachusetts, which doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. So hopefully we'll make some progress there.
And if I can actually just chime in, I think Jenny made a really good point about regulations being added and added and added. Very rarely do we have regulations taken off. And so over the years, all of these regulations have a cost and it becomes cost prohibitive. So some of the recommendations in the Chamber's report, also echoed in the Unlocking Housing Production Commission, is let's have a timeline on these regulations. So if we want to have inclusionary at X percentage, maybe in 5 years, take a look and see, did it actually hurt housing production or did it help? Because if that forced review does not happen, it will never happen. And then additional regulations will be layered on and we'll be right where that's how we got where we are today. So such an important point. And again, the Healy Driscoll administration has been great in doing that type of regulatory review. It has to happen at the state level, but it also has to happen at the local level as well.
Doug, you in your organization focus a lot on the economic health of the Commonwealth and of the municipalities, particularly the city of Boston. As you chose to leap into the housing issue, you heard the results of the report and of our report and some of the other conversations going on, things like 20,000 residents lost in New Hampshire and Florida. What are the bigger implications of this, and what's your sense of this housing crisis as it relates to the bigger picture of competitiveness and the economic health of our cities and the Commonwealth?
Yeah, I think when you look at whether it's the long-term economic growth of the Commonwealth, its regions, when you look at the public finance pressures that you see at the local level, at the state level, all of these things only work when there's people to support the economy, right? At the end of the day, it really is that simple, that if we don't have a workforce and a labor force today that's going to build the workforce and labor force of tomorrow, none of this other stuff works. And we're all just going to be sharing in higher and higher costs to support the same infrastructure for fewer people, right? And so when we look at the fact that have the same migratory patterns in terms of places like Texas and Florida, but we've also created some new competitors for ourselves since the pandemic. New Hampshire has always been one, but you look at Maine, you look at some of these other close by states where folks are maybe more able to relocate to, you just realize that we have to be honest with ourselves about the need for us to assess our policies and how they relate to the affordability of folks who want to live here. The example I always think of for the city of Boston is there's about a 20-year period when everyone wanted to be in Boston, right? Whether it was businesses, new sectors, things like that. And so you can afford to be picky, right? When everyone wants to be where you want to be, you can afford to be very picky about how you allow folks to be there. But tastes change, realities change, and we are not in 2015 anymore. And we need to make sure we have policies that reflect the fact that we don't have, we can't afford to have the same high standards for everything we want to do, because I think that really relates to what you allow to then grow in the community and in the state. And what I will say too is, I had Andy Bagley on our team pull up some data related to the competitor states identified in the Chamber report. when you look nationally, over the last 5 years, I think housing production has been like 5% growth. Massachusetts like 2.3% growth. So not only are we half the national level, we are the only state where our population growth has actually exceeded our housing production, right? And so even though we continue to suffer from these major negative domestic migration trends, thanks to international immigration, we continue to grow a little bit, but that means we're actually losing ground in some places because we're falling below just that national standard for housing production. And so that has huge implications for the economy, and ultimately that has huge implications for how we support the public infrastructure around us.
Kim, I want to pick up on your point about there's regulations that get piled on, but not many go away, and other types of initiatives around in the housing area that crop up. This year, we dodged a bullet on rent control as a ballot question. We thought it was a terrible idea. I know you did too. But nonetheless, people are talking about what now? How do we sort of breathe new energy back into it while it may have sort of been taken off the ballot this year? Nonetheless, talk more than I just did about it just being a terrible idea, about why it's a terrible idea. You've done a lot of work in this space.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to the Chamber's support on that campaign. It was quite a campaign. And obviously the amicus brief you all filed really made a difference. And obviously the SJC, we believe, ruled correctly and what they decided to do there. I do want to just pause and quickly go back to Doug's point, because when we talk about a lot of the communities right now that are struggling with Prop 2.5 overrides and really shortages in terms of revenue, when right now housing is kind of the hot issue. But if the changes are good for housing development, we should make sure we're also applying them to broader commercial development as well, not just specific to housing development. Because if we want to attract these companies to come here and we want to build these beautiful new buildings or make it a great place to do business, then we should also have these policies in place, particularly for communities that have split tax structure, because then all of that revenue will help to address all of these budget shortfalls. So we really want to encourage that commercial property tax revenue to help keep communities strong and stable. So that's just kind of one general economic development idea. Going back to the idea of rent control, I think the bottom line is this: rent control, two words together, very tempting. Certainly, people feel like they're paying way too much in rent. We did extensive focus groups and research during that campaign to hear, where people are coming from, and people of all ages in all parts of the state recognize housing's really expensive. The problem with rent control is that it doesn't actually solve that problem. If you're still paying way too much for rent each month, rent control, if done correctly, could slowly increase your rent, but it's not going to increase the production. And when we looked at places like Austin or Charlotte and other places like that, where they had a housing crisis, housing was too expensive. How did housing get cheaper? They built more housing. So our belief is that we really need to continue to be active and advocate for policies that produce more housing. And then for those, that are struggling to pay the bills each month, we need to make sure we have a safety net in place. And again, the budget that was just passed had a number of provisions in there that ensure that we have, protections for people. Eviction laws have changed dramatically since 2020, since COVID, and making sure people, are protected, have the resource and access they need to housing vouchers and other programs in place like that. So I think, it's kind of like the entire housing picture overall. There's no one silver bullet. We need to do zoning. We need to do, Jesse's here. You've done an enormous amount of work at the local level, educating some of the local communities on why we need housing. Jenny made a great point about making it personal. It's really easy to say, I don't want a new 40B project in my community, or I don't want any housing in my community. But when you make it, you talk about your kid who just graduated from college, who's living on your couch, or you talk about, your parent who's older and can't find a place to go. Once you make it personal, people understand they need to do their part. They need to help out. And that, I think, gives me hope that this is a crisis we can actually solve here in Massachusetts.
And if I could just add on to that for 1 second, I think, getting back to this idea of defining success, one of the challenges with whether it's rent control, affordability set-asides is they can be very alluring because in the definition of the policy sounds like success. We're going to control your rent. We're going to mandate that 30% of your units are affordable. And it really gets back to redefining it as, in order for housing to be available, accessible, and affordable for everyone, there needs to be sufficient housing. And that means housing production. And then when you kind of go that next that kind of layer down about what rent control means for housing production, what affordability set-asides that are super aggressive mean for housing productions, it's pretty apparent that they work in the opposite direction. And so it really gets down to that kind of simplicity of messaging that I think we heard about before, because it can be really tempting to go down these roads that sound really good, but actually are going to move in the opposite direction of where we want to be.
Yeah, Jenny, I want to bring you in on this and ask you to comment on initiatives like this that that inhibit the ability to build more housing. Rent control, of course, is maybe a poster child for that. But what do you see around the country as it relates to attempts at these types of things, whether it's excessive inclusionary zoning, rent control, transfer fees, those sorts of things?
We see a lot of political demand, particularly in left-leaning places, for local officials to do things that sound like they are helping, but that often don't help very much and can have negative consequences. And it's interesting if you talk to the providers of capitally affordable housing, subsidized housing, and ask them how they're doing with their restricted rents. They will often point out that their operating costs are going up year over year. The cost of utilities are going up, property taxes are going up, insurance is going up almost everywhere. And a lot of the affordable providers who are mission driven and want to provide for low-income households can't meet their operating costs with restricted rents because the costs go up faster than the rents do. And so putting in place rent control really creates the danger that some of your affordable housing providers are not going to be able to pay the mortgage. They're not going to be able to keep the building in operation. And if you talk to your affordable providers locally, you'll find that out too. I'll say other things like transfer taxes. Los Angeles is sort of a poster child for having done this badly. Trying to impose a mansion tax where high worth properties that sell have to pay a higher tax. What happens? You discourage properties from being sold, and it wound up being apartment buildings didn't get sold, didn't get transacted because they would have been subject to this tax. So the city doesn't get the revenues. And in fact, you don't have new buildings getting created and getting transacted and getting turned over. So this really winds up just chilling the market, and it winds up undercutting the very goals that you were trying to achieve in the first place.
And I just say on the transfer tax thing, because this I'm sure will come up again and has come up again. And it always fascinates me in that if we were to, distill the conversations we've heard, what do we hear about the challenge of housing in Massachusetts is that it's cost too much and that oftentimes local policies inhibit further production. And when you boil down what is a transfer tax, we're going to tax real estate more, and we're going to give that money to localities to build more housing. And if there's one lesson from the last 30 years, it's that left to their own devices, municipalities haven't done a very good job of that. So to me, it just seems like a fascinating solution to the problem that we often talk about.
Jenny, I want to come back to you. You mentioned focusing on the differences between urban, suburban, and rural housing development. Here in Massachusetts, we have different needs in Boston and Worcester, as opposed to communities like the Berkshires and Cape Cod and the islands and so forth. Expand on the differences and expand on the different types of interventions needed in an urban setting versus Cape Cod and the Berkshires.
Sure. So in your urban settings, remembering that what we want to do is add housing capacity, you have to look at what's already built and then imagine more of that, right? And so that's not going to be things like ADUs and starter homes in your core communities because there isn't sort of an open space that you can do. Things like the conversion of office to residential, also just making it easier to take something like a surface parking lot in downtown Boston. I mean, there shouldn't be any surface parking lots in downtown Boston. Every single one of those should have a full use on it. And so making sure that those are feasible to do. Suburban communities have often been a little bit more reluctant to go from kind of a single family exclusive community to adding in things like small apartment buildings, townhouse clusters. But if you look at the communities that were built out between, say, 1920 and 1940, they have a mixture of uses, right? Your suburbs also have a mixture of uses. They have smaller scale apartment buildings that really add a lot of capacity and a lot of choice to places. And by and large, the very tall apartment buildings are not going to get built in the suburbs because the rents don't pencil out, right? So, but you need to add this sort of diversity. I will say that Massachusetts also has a lot of communities that haven't built out water and sewer. And so there are going to be caps on how many housing units you can add. But I think it's also important to draw a distinction between rural communities where you don't have water and sewer and it's not going to be feasible to add it, and some of the wealthier suburbs like Weston that have chosen not to build in water and sewer as an excuse not to add housing. And frankly, the places that can afford to add the infrastructure should be doing that so that they can build out housing capacity in the future, and sort of giving them a free pass. You didn't build housing before, so we're not going to ask you to build it now is just not going to be sustainable.
Okay, I want to end with the whole idea behind this is let's go bold, let's supercharge. So I'm going to ask each of you to think about that. What does that mean? What are the, one, two, or three types of things Massachusetts should embrace to try to supercharge housing production in Massachusetts? And maybe Jenny, I'll start with you. You had a map that showed some of the legislative action across the country. If I remember the color coding, there was some states that had gone more bold than others. So what are some of the bolder things that are going on around the country?
So I'll put two things on the table that I think would really make a difference in Massachusetts. One is legalize townhouses everywhere on reasonably small lots. So think about the Houston model, where you can build a townhouse on, say, 1,500 to 2,000 square feet and just make this legal everywhere in the state. You can add a ton of capacity that works for rental and for homeownership. Builders know how to churn those out all day long. We have beautiful models for how that can work. And the second is Massachusetts really needs to cut back on the process. It is an incredibly hard state to get permission to build things. It takes too long, it's too expensive, it's too uncertain. If it takes 10 years to get permission to build something, you mistime the real estate cycle entirely. And so all of the regulations need to be focused on shortening that timeline, making it streamlined, making it more certain, making it easier to get things online faster.
Great. Doug?
So I will start with an idea like momentum zone, in that I do think that some of the more bold things we want to do that are going to be really challenging politically to get across the board, finding a mechanism to find willing partners to get them off the ground, demonstrate success, and show that things like prioritizing housing over energy code in certain instances, affordability set-asides. I think that's a really important thing. The other thing I would say is state resources are finite, right? And they have to row in the same direction. I think MBTA communities was a great step forward. I think using positive incentives will be even more kind of successful, because it's hard to get people to do things they don't want to do. I think a real opportunity to do that is through the state school building authority. Massachusetts, I think school building authority, it's windfall resources to communities. It's under capacity currently. It needs kind of a new look anyways. And that should be directly tied to communities that have demonstrated a commitment to have kids who are going to fill those schools, right? And that doesn't mean cutting the existing reimbursements for communities. I don't think that's about that. It's about saying that communities that are doing the right things, that are demonstrating their willingness to build, to allow new families to move in, they're going to get a benefit as they look for what is a major public finance benefit to their community. I think there are other examples of that related to MWRA and some of the infrastructure expansion, but those would be two things I'd identify.
All right. I guess I probably would build on the infrastructure piece. I mean, that's something, people have talked about. If we just extend the commuter rail out, all over the state, we'll have more housing. And the bottom line is you won't, many times because of the water sewer issues. So taking a look, again, the Unlocking Housing Production Commission has some recommendations in there on how we can address, allowing for developers to tie in to MWRA, providing incentives, and really taking a look at regulations. So that's not sexy again, but really important. And then the other one, I might get shot for saying this, but local control. Here in Massachusetts, we have 351 communities that all like to do things their own way. Why do we need to have a different wetlands bylaw in one town versus one right next door if they have, very similar, geography? We really, if DEP sets the standard for what the Wetlands Protection Act should say, communities should just follow it because it's based on science that DEP creates, versus many times communities use local bylaws to stop development and make restrictions that are not based in science. We're Massachusetts. We value education here. Let's base regulations in science. Let's reduce local control and think about, regionalization and streamlining that permitting and review process.
Well, please join me in thanking Emily, Jenny, Doug, Tamara, and of course, Secretary Mateus for joining us today. this report and this session is just some ways a beginning for us. Our intention here at the Chamber, in collaboration with our partners from other business groups, those here and others that are represented, I know, in the room and online. We're going to keep the housing conversation elevated. It is a big issue for our state's success as it relates to not only business, but the success and quality of life of our people. We want people to stay here. We want our young people to stop thinking about leaving here and not feeling like they have an alternative, but to seek their career and their homes in other places. There's so much to offer here, but this is one of the things that is one of the big challenges. And I think Massachusetts is at its best when we do come together to tackle those challenges. So we'll be right there in the fight, and we welcome all of you to join us. Thank you for being here today.